Hi, welcome to Psyphilopod. My name's Cory Clark, and I'm an assistant professor of social psychology at Durham University. And this is my co-host.
I am Bo Winegard, assistant professor at Marietta University, broadcasting per usual in an undisclosed location in Marietta, Ohio. And we are here with because so many people were clamoring for it, we are here with an emergency broadcast about are liberals being sadists? Not that sounded like sadists. Are liberals blank slatists? Let me be clear about that. Or is that an ad hominem attack? Is that correct?
Yeah, so basically, Bo and I got in a debate maybe a week or so ago about whether liberals are blank slatists or whether that's a straw man of their position. And then I started posting things on Twitter, and now everyone in Twitter is fighting about it too. So we thought we would have an emergency mini episode about what we think is going on with liberals' position regarding the extent to which things are potentially genetically caused. So I don't know, do you want to outline your position first, or should we describe what blank slatism is?
Yeah, so because I was going to say blank slate. I haven't. Steven Pinker wrote the famous book called The Blank Slate: The Modern Denial of Human Nature, and I think that's when the term started to become more popular to describe this kind of progressivism that we're talking about. But blank slate is ambiguous because in philosophy, blank slate comes from John Locke's idea that the human mind is a tabula rasa, right? But what he meant by that was not that humans don't have inborn propensities, but rather that they don't have any innate ideas. So he was arguing against other philosophers called idealists. Doesn't matter. But the point is, so the term's a little bit ambiguous. I think the way we mean it, right, when we use the term blank slate, is the view that humans are essentially environmentally determined, right?
That they're basically their personalities and their talents, would you say, not their physical bodies necessarily, but at least their brains and their psychology are pretty much entirely moldable by the environment, and you could turn pretty much anyone into anything.
Yeah, so there's that. Remember that famous, well, infamous would be a better description. There's the infamous John B. Watson quote. John Watson was an early behaviorist, and essentially he said, give me your infant and I'll turn it into anything I want.
Although I read that quote recently, and it says something like, regardless of their talents and regardless of their tendencies or propensities, which is sort of puzzling because that implies that they do have talents or propensities or tendencies, but that almost as though, not blank slate, but almost as though you could erase those and replace them with something else.
Yeah, I mean, that's
I think it's probably just a confused quote.
Right. Well, it's clearly a confused view. To be fair to Watson, in the next sentence, he says, I admit that I'm going beyond my data.
That's
but still, he's making a bold claim. So that would be sort of the paradigmatic example of, I guess, blank slatism as we mean it. And, B.F. Skinner and Franz Boas and a lot of thinkers, especially, it seems as though the blank slate got more popular in the 60s and 70s after the full extent of the horrors of the Nazi regime were revealed, and people thought that was kind of a black eye to there's intrinsic human nature, whatever. I guess we don't need to get into that. The question now is it an ad hominem attack? Well, no. Is it a straw man? Yeah. Are we burning straw men when we say that progressives are blank slatists, right?
Yeah, you see a lot of, let's say, non-progressives kind of making fun of liberals for being blank slatists.
Yes.
So we kind of wanted to start just by asking, are they blank slatists? And I would say no, almost certainly they're not. and I think I only have maybe 2 pieces of evidence to forward up this, but I think it's consistent with a lot of other data that liberals probably across the board think more things are genetically caused than conservatives. I recently just looked at one item. What was the one that I posted on Twitter? So the extent to which biological makeup influences people's talents and personalities. And liberals agree with this more as a sort of general principle. There was also an item about how much things are genetically determined, just broadly, not specifying any condition. And liberals agree with that more as well. And then you can see that...
I'm sorry, what was that latter one? How genetically determined?
How genetically determined are people's... I forget if it was personality or life outcomes or something, but something along those lines anyway. Liberals endorse that more than conservatives. And then we can see similarly for things that liberals care about, same-sex marriage or homosexuality, they think is more genetically caused than conservatives. If we look at a variety of mental health issues, liberals would say it's more genetically caused than conservatives. So we know that, at least as a broad description, liberals are not blank slatists across the board. They do believe in science, and they do believe that genes play a significant role in shaping people's personalities.
Well, do they believe in science claims? I don't know. I don't know if that's relevant right
Yeah,
here.
well...
I'll leave that aside, because of course they would say they do. Now,
they believe in a lot of science, at least.
Yeah, and so my response to this is always, and it has been for a long time, and in fact, I haven't read The Blank Slate since it came out, literally. So it's been over 10 years, I think, since I read Pinker's book. But I think I was told, and I'll take the person's word for it, that Pinker also goes over this. Yeah, which is, it's selective blank slateism that progressives adhere to. So yes, they agree, generally speaking, that, say, homosexuality has a strong genetic component, obesity, mental illness, etc. But where they become blank slatist is on sex differences or human population differences. And in those cases, they seem to contend, for the most part, that all of the differences, almost all, let's say, I won't say all, almost all of the differences are environmentally caused. Now, this is what the conclusion that I thought a lot about this yesterday. The conclusion that I came to is probably blank slate criticisms aren't particularly helpful. Now, if you read the book, The Blank Slate, it's a good book, and I don't think he uses it as a straw man, but I don't think they're very useful. I think what I will say instead is unconstrained or mostly environmentally determined. And then I think I'll just focus on specific cases rather than saying in general. So I'll try not to make a broad statement, although I do think, politically speaking, progressives adhere to a more unconstrained view of humans, but we can get to that. On this. I'm
not sure that's true, but okay.
Well, we can get to that in a moment. But in this case, what I think is important is that it's about these specific domains, sex differences, population differences, and what bothers me and what I've conveyed to you and to other people is they play this kind of game in which some progressives, in which they say, oh, of course we believe in sex differences, or of course we believe in population differences. Who doesn't? But then anytime you forward any concrete hypothesis, not only do they disagree with you, but also they depict you as either a sexist or a racist. So that's even worse, right? So that's my criticism of their method of argumentation here.
Yeah, so we have some data that speak to that. So we looked at an item, I think it was, the only reason there are differences between men and women is because of sexism. And on a 1 to 7 scale, I think very liberal, well, I think people were maybe like, they were above the midpoint on that. But then if you look at very liberals, people who identify as very liberal, like 27% of them agreed with that statement, or at least said they agreed with that statement entirely, meaning they're endorsing the statement that the only reason there are differences between men and women is sexism, which means that there aren't any other reasons. Now,
right, which is
a lot of people are
determined.
skeptical that they mean that, which seems fair to me. It seems, I really doubt that many people actually think that men and women are basically exactly the same.
Well, it's sort of, it's kind of like the geneticist from Minnesota. His name's escaping my mind right now, but he said in a related for a related belief, he said only a mind thoroughly debauched by education could believe something so outlandish.
Yeah, I like that. And then we had another one that said when people forward biological explanations for differences between men and women, they're trying to justify the status quo. And liberals agree with that above the midpoint. Yes. And then very liberals, I believe 33% of them said that is true. So anyone who says men and women differ biologically basically has nefarious motives in making that assertion in the first place. So
yeah, now to be clear, somebody on Twitter said this, and I guess this is true. He said, well, you could believe that the difference is 100% genetically caused and still think people use it to justify the status quo. I guess what I would say to that, though, is yes, I suppose you could, but the more parsimonious explanation for why you would believe it if it were true is precisely because it is true, right? So rarely do we attribute ideological motives to accurate beliefs. If you ask me why do I believe there's a tree outside, the answer is because there's a tree.
Yeah.
So
I don't know. We'll take something said, like maybe if you say men are better at tennis than women. Yeah. Why would somebody say that? Well, men are better at tennis than women. Well,
yeah, that's what I would say.
Yeah, but you might say there's really no need in pointing that out. Like people know that you're probably just trying to be a jerk to women, and that's why you're saying it.
Well, okay, but that's a different. Okay, yeah, but I'll give you an example of your statement. John McEnroe got assailed by a lot of people.
I recall.
Right, for saying exactly what you said, because he basically said, yeah, Serena Williams is the best women's tennis player in the world. And the interviewer provoked him by saying, why did you say women's? And he said, let's be real, if she were playing men, she wouldn't even be in the top 10.
I think even Serena Williams agreed to that, though. She said, yes, I would not.
At a different time she did.
A later time, yeah.
Yeah, it was a different time. So people thought McEnroe made this statement simply to be invidious, I think.
And presumably clearly, a lot of the critics of that statement would agree that the top male tennis players would be the top female tennis players, and yet they still assumed that he was saying it basically just to be an ass.
Well, but that's what
I'm saying about... Which supports whoever on Twitter said that thing.
Yeah, but that's what I'm saying about the selective environmentalism, I guess we'll call it. Because that's what happens, is in the abstract, they say, oh, yeah, of course there are sex differences. But then when you point out an obvious one, then they assume it's for nefarious motives that you pointed it out or pointed to the data or studied it, right? And I would say we have survey data, but we also have real world data, and the real world data, I think, speak compellingly to the hypothesis that, again, progressives really are selective environmentalists.
Well, and here's a potential counter argument to that.
Okay.
Well, so maybe it's not quite a counter argument, but it might not be that liberals are really strongly trying to deny the influence of let's say genes in determining differences between men and women, but they also think the environment plays a big component. And so when they assert that the environment matters a lot, people think they're denying genetic causes, but really they're just forwarding an additional cause on top of that.
But what makes me skeptical of that is just take, for example, the James Damore memo, the infamous memo. So I could, if you really believed, well, yeah, it's a lot of it's genetic, but some of it's environmental as well, I think you would have read his memo and thought, yeah, this is pretty reasonable. I would disagree, or I would maybe emphasize some more environmental effects, although, to be clear, Damore never said it's literally 100% environmental. In fact, he said quite the opposite. I'm sorry, 100% genetic. In fact, he said the opposite. But
what is the opposite of 100% genetic?
Let me rephrase that then, if you're going to cavil with me. He explicitly said it's not 100% genetic, right? Okay. So, and in fact, he discusses about how changing sex roles can change behavior, and that maybe we should change sex roles for men to a degree, etc. But whatever. Point is, that wasn't greeted by progressives as a slightly wrong but good-natured attempt to understand disparities in programming. Rather, it was treated as, quote-unquote, a sexist screed. Okay, now, if you read the thing carefully, and I did last night because we got in a dispute about it, or a little bit, and so I decided to read it again, it is an incredibly judicious and, I would say, cautious document, and it certainly doesn't make bold genetic determinism argument. So that's my complaint against.
Did you reread the criticisms from, say, Vox and some of the other
I did,
outlets?
yes.
So yes. What like specifically were they? I don't recall what, like, if they quoted lines that they said were wrong or harmful.
Yes, so they quote some, but so a lot of them glommed onto the claim that women score higher in neuroticism than men, which they just do, and that actually was replicated, or I think there was a meta-analysis that found that in 106 studies or something.
A large sample or something.
Yeah, it was, yeah. So, I mean, that's a very well-known and replicated effect in the literature. But mostly what
maybe they just report higher neuroticism because they're more willing to discuss their feelings because men are ashamed about having feelings.
Well, but it correlates with other, it has predictive validity and it correlates with things you think it should correlate with. But let's say your explanation's true, fine. Then a writer at Vox should say, yeah, Damore's using peer-reviewed literature and that's the hypothesis, but we have a better explanation, we think, right?
Perhaps,
so,
yeah.
And this is the asymmetry that I see in these debates. So I do think it's important not to strawman the one's opponents. So I don't want to strawman people, but what irritates me in these debates is that there's an asymmetrical moral imputation. I want to have conversations about these things, and most of the people who think that there's a large genetic component to these things do as well. The problem is we're getting shut down by selective environmentalists who act as though any claim of genetic causation is an outrage and is motivated by ideology.
I'm not sure they're selective environmentalists.
Yes, they're selective because when it comes to, say, homosexuality, well, of course, that must be genetic.
Yeah, but we don't know. We don't know who's more correct, right? We don't know how much environment versus genes contribute to different types of life outcomes for different groups.
Oh, I agree with that. But the reason I'm saying it's selective is because it certainly, let's say this, it seems to conform to their ideological preferences. Would you agree with that?
Yes, but do conservatives not conform to their ideological preferences?
Sure, it probably does.
So why should we pick on liberals?
And the reason we should is because they are the ones who are silencing these debates. That's what I'm saying. There's an asymmetrical sort of moral warfare such that you can make the most outlandish and ludicrous environmental hypothesis and nobody calls you anything. But if you make a pretty reasonable genetic hypothesis about, say, group differences or sex differences, people will attack you, especially progressives.
But I suspect a lot of it is out of genuine concern for the consequences of those types of claims. So, like,
genuine concern gets people on the scaffold.
But I'm saying, like, could it be true that genetic hypotheses can be more harmful than environmental ones? And should we care?
Okay, so that's a good question. Pinker, so let's step back just for a second. So I guess the first point is I think there is selective environmentalism or blank slatism, if you will. I'm going to try to refrain from that term since it's just become like kind of an insult. That's not probably helpful. So that's the first empirical question or statement. Second is, your question is, are genetic hypotheses more dangerous? Well, certainly if you swim in academic literature, you would think that they are, because people make risible environmental hypotheses. In fact, think of behaviorism. It was completely ludicrous, and there weren't many accusations of moral treachery.
They could slow down attempts at finding environmental or social solutions that can be used to make groups more equal in certain domains.
Yes, absolutely. But environmental only, or
if they're wrong, then they can be a waste of time. Yeah.
But no, not just that though. They can be. I mean, if you look at the great mass murders of the 20th century, more of them were motivated by environmental hypotheses than genetic hypotheses. Now, we tend to glom on, for good reason, to the grisly atrocities of the Nazi regime because it was incredibly barbaric. But let's think about the Soviet regime, the Khmer Rouge, the Chinese communists, etc. Blank slate environmentalism, this view that man was a product of environmental forces, and that's what caused human nature, that view was incredibly deleterious. The fact of the matter is, people don't focus on that because progressivism is so popular in academia, they don't see the danger there. Here's another danger. It can cause a lot of wasted resources. If you think that education can boost IQ 20 points and you pour a bunch of money into education, that's money that's not going somewhere else.
Yes, I would agree with that. And I think it is important to appreciate the cost of ineffective social programs. So, like, for example, if anti-implicit bias training doesn't do anything, it's potentially a shame that so much money and time has gone into it.
It's not potentially, it is a shame.
Well, it's probably created jobs.
Okay.
So that's something.
It's boosted some academic careers for sure. Yes. It's, yes, I mean, I think there
but
are...
I would agree we want to actually think through the costs of being wrong about different explanations. And I don't know how we would weight those. And even if we could, I don't know how much that should matter versus we should just try to be as close to the truth as possible and put that information out there regardless of whether it has harmful potential. I'm not sure.
I think I would. I don't have a strong opinion on this. I've contemplated it for many years and I've wavered back and forth. So now I'm just going to kind of remain in the undecided middle or something. But I think what I was thinking recently is perhaps we should have different standards for scientists and, like, say, public figures. So scientists should be motivated solely by the truth. They should attempt to just get things right and not worry about error in one way or the other or whatever. If you're a public figure, then of course you're going to weigh the consequences of what you're promulgating.
Although incentives aren't set up that way for science.
Pardon?
Incentives are not set up that way for scientists to be right.
I agree. They should be.
They're not. They're set up to generally not to be catastrophically wrong, because people will fail to replicate your work. But people want you to find evidence for things that can improve society.
Right. I agree.
That's what's going to get the funding. That's what's going to get published.
Right. But when you say improve society, I would take exception with that. It's not to improve society. It's to improve society in ways that conform with progressive dogma. Right? Because there are plenty of being right is how you change society. But what people want is proof that society is full of racism, sexism, etc., and that if we just work hard enough and go through all this kind of training, and white people flagellate themselves and admit that they're, unspeakably fiendish, then maybe we'll be better. Right?
There does appear to be some of that, yes, and we have some data that show that.
Right, because if you want to improve society, then knowing the truth is how you do it.
Probably, yeah.
For the most part. I mean, okay, that's fair. That's a strong statement. I'm not going to take that all the way, because I think there are some religious beliefs, for example, that might make society better that I don't think are true. So
yeah, we have some data showing that religion might be helpful for certain groups of people.
Right, and I'm as a
and people's biases about themselves as being better than they are might be beneficial too.
Yeah, that's another good one, right? And for another thing is, like, I don't think you should walk up to somebody in the street and say, "You're about a 4 attractiveness," just telling you the truth, and then walk home, right?
Yeah, that's probably not good.
You could defend yourself by saying, "I'm just giving people the truth," but I'm not sure that that's actually the best way to organize society.
Probably not.
But I would say this is what
the same could apply for some science, though.
I agree. That's why I'm saying I think I could understand making different moral principles about scientists proper and then public promulgators of science, right? So, like, let's say you're studying the effects of obesity on attractiveness. Okay, well, you should just study that and you should figure the answers out. I don't think you have to go to obese people and say, "Hey, did you know?"
Yes, but I suspect some people would say, is that even so important to ask in the first place? Why do you want to know if obese people are less attractive?
Yeah, well, because, I mean, for one thing, I'm just curious. It's an interesting problem. But for another, we're very interested in mating behavior and why people find certain things attractive and other things unattractive, and we can't fully understand that if we don't explore
but maybe it's better to understand 90% of the variance instead of 100% if the 100% makes certain groups of people feel really bad about themselves.
I don't share that belief, and I also think it's way more dangerous to say, "Oh, you can't study." I mean, think of the cost involved in saying that might hurt people's feelings. You can't study it.
Yeah, I would be utilitarian about it and say, how much do we lose? Do people stop trusting science if we don't ask certain questions? What is actually best for society? But I'm saying it's plausible to me that sometimes it could be bad too.
I would be utilitarian as well, but I think that the best way to arrange the utilitarian framework is not to do a cost-benefit analysis on each specific study or area of study, but rather is to organize society in such a way that what we tell scientists is, your duty, your only duty is to the truth. Then other people, you have to make moral judgments, so perhaps if you're a journalist, you don't want to write about something in science or whatever, and that's fine. And we decide, are we going to tell this individual this piece of information, etc. But scientists, quasi-scientists, should pursue the truth as best they can. Get the idea. I think it would be a lot better if we just got the ideology out of it, frankly.
I'm just trying to play devil's advocate here.
I understand. I know. But so I get this question a lot. name 3 blank slatists. Name them. Who are these blank slatists?
Mm-hmm.
And again, I want to be clear about this. These people wouldn't say that they're blank slatists or environmental determinists. In fact, they'd say otherwise. But
I
when it
suspect
comes
all
to these
scientists would say that they are, I guess maybe you'd call them interactionists or something, in that biology and environment interact. And I don't know what range of opinions you'd get if you said something like, tell me what percent of the personality differences between men and women are caused by their genes. I really don't know what range we would get among, let's say, social psychologists. No idea.
I agree, but let me read this, and listeners can make up their own mind. Now, this sounds an awful lot like selective environmental determinism to me. This is from Eagly and Wood's social roles theory. Here's the abstract. Social role theory is a social psychological theory that pertains to sex differences and similarities in social behavior. Its key principle is that differences and similarities arise primarily from the distribution of men and women into social roles within their society. Through socialization and the formation of gender roles, the behaviors of men and women generally support and sustain the division of labor. Okay, now we got into a little bit of a captious dispute about what the definition of primarily here is, because I said, I think primarily means at least 80%, and you said it's just a majority.
I said 51%, but I would go so far to say it just has to be the biggest contributor. So if there were 20 variables, it could be that this is only 12%, but it's the biggest of the 20.
I find that
and we Googled the definition of the term primarily, and I don't think it was very helpful. And I don't know if primarily means the biggest one or it has to explain a large portion of the majority of something.
Right. So what I can say, and this is, I'd say, people who have engaged the social role theory literature, and I know there are some people who probably listen to this who have engaged that, understand that it's basically selective environmental determinism. Also, I can say, my brother Robert Diener and I reviewed 17 sex and gender textbooks about the accuracy in their presentations about evolutionary psychology. And I just happened to read a lot of them because I was interested. And they most definitely promulgate a social / environmental determinism picture of sex differences. And that is precisely why when Damore writes the memo that he writes, those kinds of people get so furious. It's not because they agree 40% of the way with him. It's because they disagree fundamentally. And not only do they disagree, but also they think anybody who disagrees with them is ideologically motivated to support a patriarchal status quo.
And I think that I'm trying to be slightly more charitable to them and say that there are aspects of what they assumed Damore was implying that probably angered them more than certain scientific claims, such as women score higher than men on neuroticism. But I don't know.
I think that usually it's good to be charitable, but on this, I actually don't. I think, and I'm serious about this.
Selective charitableness.
Yes, it's
charitability.
Absolutely. It is selective charitability, and I'll tell you why I don't. Because here what is happening is people are besmirching the reputation of a perfectly decent human who happened also to lose his job because of this document. You don't know
James Damore. He might not be perfectly decent. I'm not sure.
Well, okay. He seems like a perfectly decent person, and certainly the memo does nothing to persuade me otherwise. And I find it repellent. It's one of the most repellent scientific crimes to assail a person for forwarding empirical hypotheses judiciously. I don't think we should be charitable to people for that. People should pay the consequences for doing that.
I think it's important to understand what specific things they took issues with.
I agree
and
with
then
that.
Are those things in the memo? And then are they scientifically valid? And if they're in the memo and they're scientifically valid and that's the thing they have an issue with, then we can talk about it. But I'm just not sure we really know. It was a long document. I'm not sure we really know what people specifically were upset about.
Calumniating a person for forwarding empirical hypotheses in a very judicious manner, though, is like one of the greatest violations against the spirit of science that I can imagine. And yes, I agree that I'm not exactly sure.
Vox isn't science, but...
Pardon?
Vox isn't a science outlet.
Vox?
Vox.
Yes, but they participate in the whole culture of science. And when you... So the article that stands out from Vox that I recall, it called Damore's memo a quote-unquote sexist screed. Mm-hmm. Now, I read this memo again yesterday night, and I was struck by how judicious it was. Damore goes out of his way to confess that he has his own biases and to say he's merely trying to start a conversation and he's happy to talk about the literature with people. Now, can you imagine? Let's imagine that somebody somebody at Walmart writes a memo, and it's an environmentalism memo. So it says, sex differences are mostly caused by the environment. However, I do have my biases. I admit that I guess in this case it would be I'm liberal and this is sort of a conservative environment, but you guys should just think about this. Do you really think that people in the media would have assailed that person?
I think you have to think about the concern for the consequences, because it tells me that that's what's going on. It's not about what he said in terms of these are the differences between men and women. It was the potential implications for we need to do away with these policies that people care a lot about and think are really important for trying to, for example, increase the representation of women among Google engineers.
But what if what I want
and I think you could read Damore's memo and think that he was suggesting we do away with these policies, which at the moment were the best Google was trying to do to increase representation of women at Google.
Yeah, he did suggest that some of those policies were doomed to failure that they were profoundly unfair.
Yes, he did. So saying that those policies are going to fail without forwarding a replacement that's going to be equally as effective could be perceived.
He did forward alternatives, and he also said maybe
he speculated about a couple things that wouldn't have been tested that we wouldn't know would be helpful.
Oh, right, because the programs we're using now are so helpful.
Well, I don't know how. Do we have the data on how useful those policies were?
We're using IAT training.
I don't know everything Google does to try to increase the representation of women.
Okay, but they use IAT training.
I believe they do use anti-bias training, yes.
Okay, so I respect the attempt to be charitable, but suppose we had a different case. Suppose that I was a firm believer that the sexes should not work in the same place because it was profoundly degrading to either sex, and that sex differences are 100% God-given. All sex differences are God-given. And I have a company, and you work for my company, and you say, have you thought that maybe some of them could be environmentally caused? And then you got fired because I didn't like the potential consequences of your document. You're saying that it would be okay to ridicule the person who wrote the environmentalism document and to support that person's firing?
They're not really the same thing, though, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, absolutely they are. Absolutely, because the difference is you probably share these people's goals in society, right? You're more sympathetic to their goals.
What do you mean?
Well, I guess what I would say is I frankly don't care if the programming distribution is 50-50. I want it to be whatever meritocracy leads to.
Right.
I don't think that we should want it to be 50-50.
But I think we need to think about what people actually want and what would be best for people. So we have some
I
questions. If you look at liberals, they overwhelmingly want equal representation of men and women in everything that women want to be equally represented in.
Correct.
Now, I think we'd have to think about how can we really implement this and what are the potential costs.
I think that's profoundly damaging.
I do think we want to consider what people want and what would make people happy.
Oh, I agree, and it seems
so. I don't think you saying it should be a meritocracy. Well, that's not obvious to me.
Okay, well that's fair. I'll take that back. It should be probably a reasonably close to a meritocracy because I think people perceive that as fair. Although,
but again, you're bringing up what would people want, and liberals don't want. I don't think liberals want a meritocracy.
But this is the problem because
But they would say that a meritocracy would lead to equal representation. But that's beside the point.
Evidence overwhelmingly suggests that when you allow men and women to make their own decisions, as Damore pointed out, because of differing interests, they make different career decisions, right? Okay, so the problem is selective environmentalism gets in the way and says, well, the reason that women make these decisions is not because they're autonomous agents. It's rather because they've been hoodwinked by the patriarchy. Okay, now if that were true, then we'd have to deal with it. But I think most evidence suggests that that's not true. And therefore, that's actually a profoundly destructive ideology. And also, it's a very paternalistic and alienating ideology because it says, basically, yeah, you think you're doing what you want to do, but you're not.
I think if we want to have these conversations, then we need to be charitable to the people who are concerned about women not being given equal opportunities. Now, it could be the case that they're entirely wrong. I'm not sure they're entirely wrong. I think probably just having a skewed sex representation at a company would be a deterrent for a woman to go there just based on that fact alone. If there are 75% men, I'm probably not going to feel as comfortable as if there were 50% men.
Okay, but that's a fair empirical hypothesis, and then we can talk about that.
Yes, I agree.
Nobody's saying otherwise. I think that this is where the asymmetry comes in because as I see it, nobody's saying like we should purposefully hold women out or let's not be fair and let's not try to understand these things. What people are saying. Okay, so I think it's important. What people are saying is, well, what I'm saying is, I think the social engineering drive to make society 50-50 everywhere is profoundly misguided and, in fact, damaging. That's what I would say. And
I would say anybody who disagrees with you will have made it this far into the episode.
Do I think anyone who disagrees with me?
Anyone who's disagreed with you. If anyone who disagrees with Bo has made it this far into the episode, you let us know.
I hope that they have. And I tell you what, this is what I would say. I am thrilled to talk to anybody who wants to talk to me about any of these issues. And I would never say that you should be shut down for having an environmentalist hypothesis. The one thing that you can see that I do get angry about, and I think we all should, is when people unfairly attack other people for judiciously forwarding hypotheses
but
that are backed by scientific
that should
data.
Just be a general principle for everybody that we should avoid calling people names when we're talking about the world and human behavior, totally human nature. Yeah.
Right, and I guess where you and I probably disagree.
There probably is a place to draw the line there too.
Oh yeah, I agree. I mean, I can imagine scenarios in which I'd probably draw the line, and you know that makes it complicated for sure. Mm-hmm. But I wouldn't draw the line at population or sex differences, and I don't think we should. And I would make strong arguments for that.
Yeah, fair enough. This was supposed to be a mini episode, and we're at 45 minutes.
Okay, so I'll conclude, and then you can conclude. My conclusion would be, I think that the empirical evidence suggests that there is selective environmental determinism, or close to it. Not quite, but close to it. And that, therefore, the charge of selective blank slatism is reasonably appropriate, but probably not terribly helpful. So what I think I'm going to try to do is just point out the specific cases where the environmentalism is used selectively and try to criticize those, because I think that's probably more constructive.
And what I will say is that liberals are not blank slatists, and saying they are is probably unfair. That it does appear to me that they are, maybe we won't call them selective blank slatists, but it does appear to me that they sort of motivatedly disregard certain genetic explanations for group differences. And I would like to know more about it, including, do people who claim to think that all group differences or sex differences are caused by sexism, do they really mean it? Or is that just something they're saying because it's become part of the liberal identity? And I'll try to think of ways to test that. As some people have been suggesting on Twitter, is it just signaling, or do they really think that? And I will try to keep collecting data to understand what their true positions are. And
here's a question
just hope
about
we can
that.
have productive conversations about it.
Here's a question about that one, because I thought about I don't think, so what a person explicitly believes, that is, what a person can articulate about his or her beliefs, often contradicts what he or she believes on an intuitive level. So I think almost anybody who has had a boy and a girl intuitively understands that they have differences, even if they would explicitly.
And I believe there was a study that showed that of all people, mothers with multiple children are better at estimating how genetically caused certain things are.
Yeah.
So, which is kind of interesting, because it tells we're able to sort of pick up on these just by observing the world, which is sort of cool.
Right. Right. Well, anyway, the difference between explicit and intuitive beliefs, we'll wait for another show, because that's obviously a complicated tangle.
Yep. Cool.
Okay.
Talk to you later.
Yep.